Composers typically achieve their notoriety either when they're young or after they're dead. But in this guy's case, he got famous as a senior citizen, which is kind of weird, but hey, hope springs eternal for us all. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about Leoš Janáček. And whoa, before you get on my case about mispronouncing this guy's name, contrary to popular belief, it is not actually Janáček, it's Janáček. Typically, stress in Czech falls on the first syllable, but in this case, it doesn't.
Leoš Janáček.
Yeah, and that guy is actually Czech, so ha. It's actually weird because he was from Moravia, which is the eastern part of the modern-day Czech Republic, and the typical stress on the first syllable is more of a thing in Bohemia, which is towards the west, so, linguistics. Okay, I feel like we missed something. Oh, the intro. Jim? Anyway, yes, Janáček was born in a small Moravian town of less than 600 people in July 1854. He was a gifted singer as a kid, and he took to keyboard instruments after he was introduced to them. The piano and organ life was obviously a much more viable career than just being in a choir, and his choir director helped him get into the Prague Organ School in 1874. You may recognize this if you watch the video on Antonin Dvorak. And Dvorak was at the organ school about 20 years prior to Janáček. Janáček and Dvorak met at some point in here and were friends, which is remarkable considering that Janáček didn't hold very many composers in extremely high regard. He regarded Dvorak and Tchaikovsky with nothing but unreserved musical affection. Everyone else he had his problems with to one extent or another. The organ school had good faculty, but had a rather lackluster reputation when it came to the quality of their facilities. Basically, they had shabby facilities. And Janáček did not come from a wealthy background, and so he could not afford to have a piano in his room. He actually had to practice by drawing out a keyboard on his desk and miming playing the notes. That is, until one day, a piano just showed up at his door one day, and at the end of the semester, it just as mysteriously disappeared. He had a mysterious benefactor somewhere within the school who felt bad for him and wanted him to have what a lot of the other students had. He doesn't appear to have ever returned their kindnesses necessarily, as he was very vicious in his criticisms of performances or pieces that he did not like. Essentially, he had no tact when it came to reviewing performances given by the faculty, and once he wrote a rather scathing review of one of the faculty performances, and he ended up being this close to getting kicked out of the school. On the one hand, you have to respect the fact that he did not hide his disdain just because it involved one of his superiors, but all the same, you gotta pick your battles, man. His organ school experience meant that he could make ends meet as he traveled around the continent looking to further his compositional tools. First, he went to Leipzig, and then he went to Vienna. All told, he spent a grand total of 7 months in both cities. His plan in Leipzig was to cram 3 years of study into one really busy year. Unfortunately, he ran up against the hard edges of the institution's policies, and he was unable to do any of that. He left after just several months. Believe it or not, his time in Vienna was even less productive. These experiences collectively culled his desire to be a pianist and organist and composer, and from here on out we see him as someone who just pursued composition. He didn't get along with the faculty at either place, and in July of 1881 he returned to his native Moravia, to the biggest city, the de facto capital of Brno. There he married his pupil Zdenka Šulcova. She was 15 at the time. Creepy? Yes. A product of the times? Unfortunately, also yes. The thing is, whatever spark they felt at the beginning of their relationship died pretty quickly. The resentment they felt for each other grew over time, and the fact that 2 of their kids died was the, nail in the coffin. What, too soon? He was also very blunt in his dislike for the Germans. He was fluent in the language, but he resented what he saw as a cultural occupation they had in Moravia. His father-in-law called his pro-Czech attitudes borderline insane national fanaticism. This was another wedge between him and his wife, and she may have shared his sentiments, but she definitely did not agree with how he went about presenting these sentiments. At this point, it would appear that Janáček was totally stuck. He wanted to be a composer, but he didn't have a whole lot of compositional training. He didn't have very many friends within the field, as it were. Just a smattering of professors up and down the continent who thought he was unfit to be a student. He did, however, have a lot of experience as a music director and as a critic, and so it was in these categories that he staked his claim. Compositionally, he sought to bring forward what Smetana and later Dvorak had done in taking Czech folk music and installing that into a place in the larger Western canon. Janáček wrote choral music and he wrote piano music, but he had his eyes set on a bigger prize, a true Czech opera. Dvorak was at this point the head honcho, the big daddy, if you will, of Czech music. Please don't call him Big Daddy. Unfortunately, Dvorak had really no success in the operatic world. There were very few composers who could be successful both in the concert world and the opera world, and Dvorak didn't write bad operas necessarily, they were just incredibly hard to stage because he called for a lot of characters. So Janáček set about writing Jenufa, a truly interesting opera that combines not just these Czech folk idioms, but also the verismo style that was popular in Italian opera around this time, a sort of gritty, down-to-earth realism. Not only is it all in Czech, it's also all in prose, relatively rare for the time. It's also rarely performed with its original and then subsequently withdrawn overture, linking it with other very gritty, realistic operas like Richard Strauss's Salome. The plot centers around these tangled messes of relationships, an out-of-wedlock pregnancy and birth, against a very conservative town as a backdrop, and eventually, spoiler alert, the baby is murdered. Fun for the whole family! Not a single melody in Jenufa comes from a folk source, which speaks to a larger trend amongst folk-inspired and so-called nationalist composers like Janáček and others who were working in this time. They were very much inspired by the folk traditions of their respective homelands, but rarely, if ever, quoted a folk tune directly. Furthermore, and this is where Janáček really starts to set himself apart, he was fascinated by speech, specifically the speech patterns of his native Moravia. Even if he didn't understand your language, he wanted to hear you speak it, just so he could get some inspiration out of the cadences and the flow of your words. This meant that for Janáček, the difficulties of setting Czech, a pretty thorny language to set when compared to, I don't know, Italian or something, was really not much of a problem at all. He leaned into the fact that his operatic characters were not singing so much as they were speech singing. He overcame the nuts and bolts difficulties of text setting and was able to look at the larger picture, the dramatic flow of the work. But it wasn't just speech either. The gentle hum of gnats, of bees, or even of telegraph wires could serve as a point of inspiration. He listened intently to all sounds and what they might give to his music. Not that far a cry from a full half-century later when John Cage would go on to claim that all sound was music. This was of course filtered through his style to give a sense of realism and a sense of groundedness to his work. For Janáček, music wasn't just in instruments, it was in living beings, it was in the universe. Heavily pantheistic imagery for a supposed atheist. The sense of realism that contributed to the verismo elements in Jenufa aren't necessarily intended to be primitivistic in a proto-Stravinskian sense. They're expressions of Janáček's interactions with elements of his culture, not the culture itself. You might think that's a distinction without a difference, but with Janáček, his music is so different from a lot of other composers that we really need to be precise in how we talk about it. Janáček had a fondness for unique and jagged textures that he could squeeze out of chords, as well as other ostinato-like figures, which is very much juxtaposed against sections which are more lyrical and outwardly melodic. As such, Janáček's mature style incorporates opposites in a way that fuses them together. Contrast this with Stravinsky, or later Alfred Schnittke, who used different elements in disparate ways but did not fuse them together, just sort of plunked one style here and then one style there and built their form out of the juxtaposition of styles instead of trying to find some common ground between them. The jaggedness that I mentioned probably has something to do with Janáček's own distinctive jagged speech patterns. When applied to opera, this is a breakaway from the late Romantic excesses of composers like Wagner. Wagner emphasized an unending melody built out of a series of leitmotifs to represent characters and actions and situations, where the drama was being unfolded within the music, and then the voices were just on top. Janáček broke the melody down to smaller, more manageable chunks, and he put the vocal lines front and center. For Janáček, Wagner was much too symphonic, and his leitmotif technique was much too inflexible. For Janáček, the late Romanticism that was embodied in composers like Wagner was simply not expressive enough. He felt as if late Romanticism was not doing itself any favors in wringing the maximum emotional expressivity out of music. Part of this also ties into his study of Moravian folk tunes. Moravian folk tunes are much more about the cadence of the words and the lyrics. They're much more intimately tied into the speech patterns of their dialect, whereas Bohemian folk tunes are much more dance-like. He called this approach speech melody. This approach to smaller scale structures, repetitiveness, and slow building have led some critics to see Janáček's music in a proto-minimalist light. But the surface-level similarities between Janáček and the minimalists are merely coincidental. Whereas the minimalists were after very slow and audible musical processes, Janáček's musical process really isn't all that audible. That is, you can't hear all the techniques he's using in a piece. The effect is somewhat similar on the surface, I grant you, but Janáček is more montage-esque. Janáček's approach to rhythm was entirely unique, and he used many terms that are almost impossible to translate well into other languages. This is part of the problem with Janáček. It's very frustrating because he left behind all these writings, all these theoretical concepts that we could use to look at his music and be able to understand it as he understood it. Unfortunately, not only did he come up with a lot of these terms, and so it's hard to translate these terms into English, which remains the lingua franca of musicology, but also he spoke in the Moravian dialect with its many folk idioms. It's almost impossible to tell exactly what he means, and as I mentioned, nuance is so important in Janáček that you have to be very certain that you know what you're talking about. When compared to other Central and Eastern European composers of this time, there is comparatively, vis-a-vis what we have in the original Czech, less information in English about Janáček. Consider also that it took until over a decade after the Berlin Wall fell for us to get access to his personal writings and manuscripts. They haven't been in the public knowledge for a very long period of time. Like any composer with significant theoretical writings, it's important that we look at his music through the lens of what he told us about his music. This is in large part because his music resists forms of traditional analysis. It occupies this weird liminal space between the Czech-inspired folk heritage celebrating worlds of Smetana and Dvorak and the more radical modernist approaches of composers like Béla Bartók, who was Hungarian, not Czech, but globalism. Janáček's style was so unique that even familiar musical traits, common and easily identifiable as the traits of other composers, sounded totally different in his hands. This was partly because he was so thorough in his analysis of other pieces. His handling of the whole tone scale, the Debussy signature, is not ever going to be confused for Debussy. In Jennefa, for instance, the whole tone scale is used for episodes of sadness and despair. Later on in his life, Janáček would be enthralled with the score to Debussy's La Mer. So even though you might say that some of Janáček's later works would be inspired by his study of Debussy, they are wholly divorced from what Debussy did with these particular musical traits. I've gone on a long time about his musical style, but let's get back to his life. He was very much obscure, and he was at a dead end. This had something to do with his Czech heritage. His operas were not popular enough to bother translating into other languages, and his choral music also rubbed up against this language barrier. He, of course, had his supporters and champions, but they were all insular. They all lived and worked in Brno. The most he felt he could ever get was as the composer from Brno. He did not think that he had a chance at national renown, let alone international renown. It didn't help that he turned some directors against him because of his tendency not to mince his words in scathing reviews. Some people just never learn. It's telling that even his pupils thought he was odd. Not mean, per se, but definitely someone who had a unique enough personality that you had to get used to it. He resigned himself to tolling and compositional obscurity, destined to be one of the many composers whose career is not defined out of their works, but rather out of their career in academia, who he taught, and the institutions that he founded. Two things that he had great pride in, but it wasn't what he set out to do. Eventually his small band of supporters won out, and Jenůfa had its Prague premiere in May of 1916. Once he'd established a foothold in the capital, which absolutely loved the piece, it was much easier for him to go about getting a performance in other cultural capitals. Finally, after all hope was lost and abandoned, Janáček was finally a known composer. He'd successfully towed the line between the radicals and the traditionalists. Before the Prague premiere, this meant that both sides hated him, but after the premiere, both sides loved him. Both the traditionalists and the radicals saw something in Janáček that they could admire. Although he had students, none of them followed the trail he blazed, assuring the uniqueness of his personal style. This uniqueness would come back to bite him when various conductors thought that he made glaring errors in the orchestration, when in reality he was just going against the established orchestrational tendencies for specific effects. But Janáček's reaping of his long overdue reward was not merely a laurel-resting exercise. On the contrary, he felt more inspired than ever before, ready to take on big projects. He said that this success made him feel like he was living in a fairy tale, with an inexhaustible well of inspiration. Not only was he appreciated in his country, he also felt like he actually now had a country. Czechoslovakia came into existence as a geopolitical entity in 1918, and Janáček was Czechoslovakia's first composer. But further than that, his biggest and most poignant point of inspiration was a married woman, Kamila Stosilova of Bohemia. Though he would say that his true family was music, he was finally totally in love. While not all of his late pieces are inspired by Kamila, a good many are, not the least of which was his second string quartet, subtitled Intimate Letters, where the viola portrays the role of Kamila. Originally, before he realized that the orchestration would clash, Janáček wanted the viola not to be the viola, but rather the archaic Baroque instrument, the viola d'amore, the viola of love. To be fair, Kamila never actually reciprocated Janáček's feelings for her, but she never, told him to go away either. She seemed like she was just too nice to tell him to shut up. Also, she was, as mentioned, married. Also, he was 4 decades older than her. Although, that didn't seem to stop Von Williams any. She always made sure that she maintained her emotional distance. She knew that she was his muse, but all the same, didn't reciprocate his feelings in the slightest. And it's not even clear, despite all the music that he wrote and dedicated to her, or the opera characters that were inspired by her, if she even liked his music. As far as what his wife Zdenka thought, well, she was just over it by this point. In previous years, her husband had had an ultimately short-lived crush on a Croatian soprano named Gabriela Horvatova. She had taken the role of this character in the Prague premiere of Jenůfa. Zdenka had been so distraught by this that she attempted suicide. She failed, but thereafter pretty much all but in writing divorced her husband. They never officially did because that would lower both of their social standing, especially hers, unfortunately, but they essentially lived separate lives from then on out. Late in life, Janáček was inspired by Kamila and went from success to success, turning out some of his biggest, baddest pieces, which include his late operas as well as his famous Sinfonietta and a weird capriccio for piano left hand, flute, and 6 brass instruments. But eventually his health caught up to him after many, many years of near constant work. While on vacation with Kamila, he was out late at night looking for her son in the woods. He caught pneumonia and died in August of 1928 at the age of 74. Janáček was a man with a complicated personality, bubbly and effusive and enthusiastic, but just as easily reticent, cold, and blunt. One gets different views of Janáček when one sees him through the perspectives of his friends and colleagues. To Kamila, he was an emotional and hopeless romantic, fueled by a joie de vivre in the November of his life. To his exasperated wife, he was insensitive and impossibly complex. To the pupils at the Brno Conservatory he founded, he was an ultimately kind and generous soul, full of wonder at the world, once you stripped away the turbulent outer edges. Like his life, his political philosophy and how it related to his music is a very complicated subject. So complicated that in different periods it was used as examples of both anti-communist music and pro-communist music. Was it formalist or was it not formalist? That is the question. Like anything Janáček, music, life, what have you? The answer is complicated and cannot be reduced to a simple binary. For Janáček, as with many other nationalistic composers, music was the soul of the nation. But Janáček went further, pinpointing opera as the greatest artistic embodiment of a people and their culture. This shows up as a common thread throughout his operas. They combine what made the Czech people great with what made the Czech language great. He was deeply committed to his homeland and his people, and he also had a deep desire to show that off in the form of his operas. Not only that, but he wasn't just Czech in his heritage. He very much admired the Russian culture, was fluent in Russian, and went to Russia several times to absorb their culture and incorporate that into his musical language. This is how he befriended Tchaikovsky. He thought Russia and Russian culture was the proper antidote to the Teutonic influences that had infected his homeland. He identified the unifying element in his music above all else as truth pushed to its limit. Classical Nerd is now on Facebook at facebook.com/classicalnerd. Link is in the description. Big Daddy.